In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the story element plot. Plot is the sequencing of events in the story. There are 5 components to the plot: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is composed of the exposition and the conflict is introduced. The middle is composed of the rising action and the climax, and the end is composed of the falling action and the resolution. Now, a plot can be put into a diagram as you see here. At the bottom we have the exposition, which is where the story starts. As the conflict is introduced and more conflicts are introduced throughout and problems are building and building and building, that's when we have our rising action, which leads to the climax, the height of the action. Eventually there is a turning point in the climax, which then leads to the falling action and then finally to the resolution. Notice that the climax is actually closer to the resolution. The rising action is composing most of the story because of the fact that the climax is going to be so close to the resolution. So let's look at the elements of plot. First we have the exposition, which introduces the characters, describes the setting, and establishes a problem in the story. Now, the problem of the story is also known as the conflict, and it needs to be solved before the story can end. After the conflict is introduced, you have what's called the rising action, which is where suspense builds, and this is where multiple conflicts can come into play. Remember, a story does not always have just one conflict. It can have one main conflict, but it can also have smaller conflicts in between. So that suspense is going to build from all these problems and become more complicated. So that in the rising action is also going to have multiple steps or parts that are going to lead up to the climax. So then the climax is basically the turning point in the story. It's typically the most exciting part of the story where you're at the edge of your seat waiting to see what will happen. After the climax, you have what's called the falling action, which is when all the events after the climax that's going to lead up to the resolution or to the ending of the story. And finally, the resolution, which is the outcome of the story, is basically just how things end up or how things turn out for all the characters. So let's go back to the exposition and look at it in more detail. So the exposition, like we said, was the very beginning of the story. And it's going to do 3 things. First, it's going to introduce the characters. So you're going to learn where the characters are from, who they are, how they act, how they sound, what they look like. So all these things you're going to learn right at the beginning of the exposition. Now, that doesn't mean to say you're going to only learn about the characters in the exposition. You learn the majority of what you need to know in the beginning. Yes, you can learn things about the characters later on in the story, but for the most part, the exposition tells you what you need to know right off the bat. The exposition is also going to set the setting. So it's going to tell you the time and place of where all this is happening, so you can kind of get an idea of how the setting is going to affect the characters and move the plot forward. And then finally, the exposition is going to introduce the conflict. So this conflict is what's going to get the ball rolling and get the sequence of events really started in regards to the plot. And so that conflict is going to make it so that the characters are going to start acting on it, and that it's really going to get the rising action started. So then after the rising action, you have what's called the climax. The climax is the highest point of tension in the story, and it's going to lead to the resolution. So here I have an example of a climax and what a climax also does not look like. So looking at the example, it says Cinderella slips her foot into the glass slipper. The slipper fits. The prince knows that Cinderella is the woman he fell in love with at the dance. So here we can tell that this is a climax because, number one, the problem is solved. The problem was that the prince didn't really know who Cinderella was, and Cinderella was living as a servant in her family's house. And so now the slipper fits and it's going to solve all their problems, right? And also, the characters are acting on the problem to actively solve the problem. So that's how you kind of know that this is a climax. Now, looking at the example that's not a climax, Cinderella's stepmother locks her in her room. Cinderella cannot break the lock, so she sits in a chair and waits for someone to let her out. Well, in this case, it's not a climax because, number one, the problem has not been solved, and number two, the character is not acting to solve the problem. Remember, in order for it to be a climax, the problem has to be literally actively being solved, and the characters have to be the ones solving it. Now, if Cinderella was banging on the door, knocked it down, and then reveals herself to the prince, that would definitely be a climax because she's actively trying to solve the problem. But in this case, since she's not doing anything, it's not a climax. So once the problem starts getting solved, you have the falling action, which leads to the resolution. So the resolution comes near or at the end of the story after the climax of the falling action. And the resolution is going to do a couple of things. Usually it's going to tie up any plot loose ends. So for example, what happens to certain characters, usually minor characters, what ends up happening to them. Any other remaining questions you might have would probably be answered in the resolution. It's going to describe how the conflict was resolved and let the reader know what happened to the main character. If something's going to happen later on to the character, it might hint as to what comes next for them, and it's also going to provide a satisfying ending. And then finally, let's talk about the setting. The setting of the story is the time, place, and society where the story happens. So it's going to be revealed by how the characters dress and how they talk. So for example, if my characters are wearing, synthetic clothes and they have, machine parts on them built into their body, and they're speaking, very robotically, I might say that this is like a futuristic society. Excuse me. If my characters are speaking, you know, in old English and they're wearing robes and, they're carrying swords, I might think that this is taking place in, ancient times. So, the characters definitely can reveal the setting. Now, the setting also is going to create a mood or an atmosphere for the story. What the mood is how the story feels, right? So if I have a character and she walks into a forest and the light is gleaming through the green trees and there's butterflies and rainbows and fireflies and sparkles, obviously the mood is carefree and happy, okay, lighthearted. She's obviously safe, right? But if my character walks into the forest and it's dark and there's such a dense fog that she can't see her hands in front of her and she can hear the howling of wolves and the glowing of eyes and feel the breath of the creature on her neck, okay, obviously the mood has changed. It's terrifying and it's fearful. So the mood of the story is definitely revealed in the setting. And so the setting is going to affect the characters. For example, if my character is in a boat and there's a rogue wave that comes and hit them, okay, well that's definitely going to affect the character because now there's the problem. The setting can even be the problem. So the setting is really important because it's going to affect the plot, and it might even be what causes the plot to move forward and might be what's causing the plot to actually have a good storyline. Okay, so this has been Plot, and hopefully now you understand it just a little bit better.